we could use with this technology if it was fielded. One thing I dealt with in the UK that was kind of eye-opening to me, again, as a junior officer, as a lieutenant, was, after the UK had fielded its capability, the reality that the contingent capability requirements really hadn't been defined, and now we were trying to find a way to use the capability. It's something that we hoped in writing this piece would be an eye-opening aspect of, who and how are we defining these contingent capability requirements from the assets that we are acquiring? Is it the manufacturer that is providing that asset that is delivering us a product and we say, yeah, that actually meets it? Is it a bunch of operators that sit around that necessarily may have a conflict of interest in fielding a capability that could, significantly affect their ultimate career path and their community and organization? Or is it directed from on high that we must find ways to add these capabilities to our arsenal so that we are able to continue to compete with other nation-state actors who are fielding and have those mandates in place to have an efficient and effective system to counter the threats that they also see?
Yeah, let me kind of pull the thread on that, because a theme that I could detect in the background in your article is the challenge that involves with, as you mentioned in the first part of your response, an emotional and other aspects of the human response to things that are new. The incentives, disincentives, culture, even career path arguments. And previous guest also mentioned experimentation and competition and trying to see how that works. And y'all did mention, and we also mentioned earlier in the show, an example everybody likes to talk about is for the Second World War, the influence of the battleship admirals. And when you look at the time period from the First World War to the Second World War, really, your basic career path from midshipman to captain or colonel, yes, the battleship admirals dominated. However, there were tremendous, especially in the last part of that from 1930 to 1941, huge advances in not just the technology, but the use and the concepts around, two relatively novel items coming out of the First World War, submarines and naval aviation, to the point that by the time Pearl Harbor came around, we were 6 months away from having the best air wing of any naval service in the world. However, there seems to be something missing in our culture today that, in spite of all the power of the battleship admirals, they seem to be able to work around back there. And those things about, incentives and disincentives, cultures, and, things as mediocre as career path, when you look at the human dynamic of the barriers that are between us being able to better advance in this area, what do you think is the most challenging barrier that needs to be attacked?
This is Spool. To start off, I think exposure events is really important in understanding how the system works and how, because they're all very different. And what you see, and I've done many tours of different systems, provided those tours, and things like the RT-21 Blackjack and different versions of the RT-7B Shadow and the MQ-5 Hunter and MQ-1C Gray Eagle and MQ-9. And what you'll find is, so each system is different, but without having spent a lot of time on those systems and employed them in combat, it's oftentimes hard, because without the previous exposure, you apply your own mental model to what it is that you're seeing. And so if you're a tanker or an infantryman or a fighter pilot, you see the exact same hardware, you see the exact same experience differently. But unless you understand the underlying capabilities, what makes them possible, and are able to have that deeper level conversation, I think a lot of what you see in those kind of demonstrations gets lost. And so, we're talking about this a couple days ago as a group, and I'd like to just highlight the simple point of what's changed, and because change now today is very much software driven with almost all of these systems. And so radio communications and modern modem capabilities in the 90s really changed how we communicate with remotely operated vehicles. And things very quickly became digital, and payload capabilities increased. And miniaturization of the hardware, miniaturization of the compute power has had a significant impact as well in the size of the payloads and the capabilities of these payloads. But so that's kind of a hardware compute opportunity, but all of these systems today are driven by software. So what happens as software becomes much more capable, and that software, it's not a transistor, it's not some specific thing you have to go manufacture and then go through this, extensive traditional development program that may take 10 or 15 years. Instead, it's a revision of code that delivers a new capability. So what happens when you can do that overnight and kind of like Tesla did with their cars, deliver increased performance because battery management has changed, as an example. I don't think we're really prepared to think like that. And so we need to invest in our people in a very deliberate way in all of these different capability areas. So it's not just about communications and the ground control stations and what compute power means and how is machine learning develop an algorithm for one application, or what does a training data set look like, or what does commercial satellite processed through AI look like. It's all of these different things together. We have to be able to talk smartly across disciplines in this new advanced world that moves at the speed of software. And that's a very different thing, but I don't think the force across the services, Air Force, I would say, is probably the furthest along in making this cultural change, just from observations, because I'm living on an Air Force base right now and have worked with some of these programs. But this is a generational change.
Yeah, I think, again, in my son's paper, he points out that to fully adopt unmanned systems requires trust that those systems will function as expected, and this trust is built upon understanding the systems. If someone understands the systems, they understand what's required for the system to work. And if you understand how the system works and its capabilities, then you know how to use them. And a lot of the younger generations who grew up playing video games, and they're used to technology. Not that our admirals are all old fogies who don't use technology, but there is a. I'm going to go back to the Air Force thing. You had Air Force Lab ran that experiment. I can't remember the name of it, but it ran the tested AI against an Air Force pilot in a simulation, and the AI won every single time. 13 fights or something. Anyway, but even then, the AI had its hands tied. It was using the same aircraft with the same capabilities and restrictions. The AI still won, but if it had been less restricted, because by unmanned systems being able to fly faster, turn harder, pull more Gs, there was no need to worry about the squishy human in the middle of it, as my son said. Then the system that's unmanned, especially as you just say, with constantly updated input and learning, it seems to me that this, if you understand that, it's really hard not to get the idea that maybe these systems would be really useful to us. Are there thoughts on that?
I think completely. And there was actually an article that was released about actually wanting to fly. Having an Air Force pilot in an actual F-16 airborne to kind of dissuade some of the naysayers about the restrictions that were placed on that Alpha dogfight that was put on by DARPA, and take out some of those artificialities. A lot of things that restrict us are, where we are beholden to training rules, and we have a certain comfort level about how close or what aspect you're going to approach another aircraft with, and obviously the artificial intelligence driven in the simulator in the alpha dogfight was willing to disregard all that, still operate within the safe margins that were directed by the event, but as claimed from the folks that participated in that, that comfort level was still not eroded from the human pilots in that overall event to actually achieve any measurement of success against the AI. But I think as Colonel Spataro talked about, finding places to build trust, mission areas to build trust. We're not talking about going to dogfighting immediately, but finding areas beyond just error refueling to build that trust, to integrate those systems. I'm not speaking necessarily from a position of absolute certainty here, but we just went through Carrier Air Wing integrated training last year in Fallon, and right now, at that point, or at least that we had been briefed to, there was not any entity within the organization of the Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center that was looking to integrate any type of unmanned aerial system or artificial intelligence into the Carrier Wings application. Now, that from our perspective as the customer of that training, it wasn't yet fielded, so we necessarily didn't need to train or practice to any of that or have any involvement or knowledge. But again, in terms of building that trust, having a cell stood up to find ways in which we can insert capabilities or identify capability gaps that we have where AI or UAS would be implemented, and then developing that in the overall concept of employment, concept of operations, and making, again, the aviator and the air wing feel comfortable that these capabilities are being implemented and how we're going to implement them. And as with any model, what are the limitations and what are the assumptions? Because without that knowledge there, use of that model or use of that system is not going to be fully realized, nor will it be appropriately executed within the concept of employment. But finding those discrete mission areas where we can start to build that trust, I think, is the most important piece. And one of the main reasons that we wrote the article is, again, to get the discussion going, but also to find those areas in which we can start to build that trust amongst the community and get the discussion going.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the other things my son wrote about was the fact that with machine learning, the AI pilots could start out, if you want to call them pilots, right out of flight school with the knowledge of Chuck Yeager or John Boyd, and only get better from there because the machines are connected directly. They have shareable intelligence. That seems to me that if that needs to be a point that's got to be pushed. It takes us a long time. One of my sons is an F-18 driver, so it takes us a long time to train pilots to a skill level that these machines, if they're properly programmed and set up, could start out with, or even beyond. I think, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and absolutely. And I think the other thing that we are, in terms of the operator level, at least very in an infant state about doing, is talking about risk. So with these systems, ideally, many of them would be down to the cost level of being attritable in an actual conflict, where we can accept a greater risk of something not going right in terms of their overall capability, not necessarily in terms of executing a wrong decision, because we're not at the point where we're talking necessarily full autonomy of the actual decision to employ, decision to execute. But the 80% solution may be sufficient in that type of actual conflict, where we often train in terms of the certainties that we need to achieve the mission objective with manned aviation, because we only have that one maybe fleeting opportunity, or if the risk to force is so great that we attrite half of the force, our ability then to go and prosecute the next day or have any significant impact on the mission would be significantly degraded, where if we're able to field a greater number of less costly assets, that if we lose a greater number of them but have a greater chance of achieving that mission objective, decisions would be significantly different. And again, I think that also goes into the trust that you're talking about from your son's article about introducing that into the force employment and having that be a more normal aspect of how we think about prosecuting the enemy.
I always thought that, and I'm going to steal this phrase in the future, the concept of being tolerance for attrition, attritable, is I'd always thought that, as in all these things, you're not going to get the perfect system. You're not going to get the most advanced system to start off with. You're going to have basic, and you're going to learn, you're going to build, and you're going to learn things you didn't know you were going to learn, and you're not going to learn things you thought